Hey, Jared,
Oh,
how are you?
hey, how's it going? I'm doing okay. How about you?
Okay. Okay, I think we've got all the papers graded except for Dee
Okay.
Dee.
Mhm.
So, and we're gonna have a guest come on. He's just gonna come on and he's just gonna listen. I'm not quite sure what that's all about, but anyway, that's a faculty thing. So just don't be surprised. And yeah, so I'll go over the introduction and go over some Cone and go over some Williamson, and then we will have Chance do his discussion starter. And I posted a bunch of things on the Populi, so I wonder if you saw that, the
The rubric?
rubric. Yeah,
I did see the rubric. Yep.
okay, all right.
So that will be very helpful. And yeah, I guess anything else us to know before we let people in?
I don't think so. You can always send me a message.
Of course.
Okay.
Excellent. Let's
Okay.
get to it.
Okay, I'm gonna make you co-host so you can do whatever you need to do.
Great. Hello, all.
Hey, good afternoon. How's everybody? Jared, Dr. Russell?
Hi. Oh, you look
Sir.
nice dressed up.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's one of those days.
Yeah. You're not
One
just
of those.
dressed up to.
No, I would have happily put on a Bears jersey today, but we called.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So I hope everybody had a Thanksgiving filled with yummy food and delightful family and friends and/or friends. Yeah, good.
It was a good Thanksgiving, but I just wanted to give a heads up. I'll probably be more of a listening participant today because our Thanksgiving break ended with Maggie getting an ear infection, and we were both up most of the night last night. So
I'm
just
sorry to hear
FYI.
that.
I mean, she's fine. She just, didn't sleep.
Yeah,
So.
well, I know what that's like. Yes. So here's the way I think we're going to go today. We've got two different readings to do. We've got Dr. Cone, James Cone's work on the Spirit. Mostly he doesn't talk much about the Spirit, actually. He talks about the church and ministry and eschatology. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll move on to Williamson, because we've already talked a little bit about the Spirit from him. And sorry, I got my phone in here. And then we'll move on to Williamson and his discussion about liturgy and the sacraments. And then we will have time for Chance's discussion starter. And I just want to give everybody a heads up. I know I've sent you an email about this, but Dr. Byer will be joining us at some point. Well, there goes the bird. I'm not sure where she went, sorry. And so he's just observing. So we're just having faculty observe each other's classes. And so I doubt that he'll say anything, but maybe he will, I don't know. Anyway, so before we get started, I do want to remind you that your credo is due next week. And that's the final paper for this class. I've posted rubrics and more detailed description, some questions that I hope will be helpful in the Populi. So I'm hopeful that one of the things that's particularly helpful to keep in mind, it's not just cut and paste where you take your other two papers, but it is writing those other two papers is meant to give you a lot of give you a running start on getting the credo done. So you've thought about and written about your methodology, you've thought about and written about what are your core beliefs and how those might influence and function in the way that you're going to talk about what it is you believe. I believe, credo is I believe. I've asked you to also reflect upon that critically, gotten some feedback. The same things, we've done that with your Christology section, and you've gotten feedback both from myself and Jared in most cases, as well as one of your colleagues. Hopefully you've got some good feedback from your colleagues about that, so that you can make some revisions to that, make it more clear, make sure that you're writing as well as you can. This is, this credo, it used to be like the core of the curriculum, because it really does lay a foundation for how you're going to do ministry and who and what you want to do and be in the world as the pastor, or as a person who is, whether you are a lay person or a clergy person. And then I've asked you to choose one other doctrine, and that can be sin. That can be understanding of who God the Father is. It could be church. It could be spirit. Often spirit and church kind of come together, but not necessarily. So I've invited you to, I invite you to pick one of those. And I want you to stick with something that's related to your typical understanding, our traditional way of understanding systematic theology in this particular class. In other classes, we focus on other topics that aren't limited to this structure of systematic theology. So some of you may be familiar with the structure of systematic theology, which is, you can see in Williamson's book in particular, but you can also see in Tillich's book. I know Chance is reading Paul Tillich. You've got a nice structure of what do we mean by systematic theology, and deal with all of these different topics. At the beginning of the class, I talked about the difference between constructive theology and systematic theology, and how what we're doing in this class is a kind of combining the two. So we're taking the systematic structure, but we're inviting and encouraging you to be constructive in the way that you understand those doctrines, the way those doctrines and those questions that are being asked in the theology, in the systematic theology, we've reframed it as, what are the questions being asked? So we've thought about, well, who is God? Who's Jesus? Who are we? What are our problems? What have we done? How does God, Jesus, the church help us address that problem? And then what are we called to do? Who are we called to be of service to, and in what ways can we do that? And then what is the end? What's the goal? What's the fulfillment? And so I'm inviting you to engage the sources that we've read. I shouldn't say sources, I should say the authors that we've read, in constructive and critical ways, and also include your own ideas about how you understand these doctrines, these questions. How do you answer these questions? The second thing about constructive theology and systematic theology is that all the elements are related. So it's an interwoven ball of twine in some way, or an engine, or it's a structure, like whatever that game is where you build a secure bottom and then you slowly put things on top. You've got to have the things you've got to have the elements, the foundations strong, so that each element you build is related to that foundation. You're not going to put it over here, right? So that's part of the hope, is that as you're doing this constructive work, that you're also thinking about, well, if I'm going to talk about how I understand sin, it needs to be correlated in some way with how you're understanding who Jesus is, or how you understand Jesus, which you've already written about, needs to be correlated with how you're going to understand church, or I should say the opposite, how you understand what the church is and what we're called to, who we're called to be, how we're called to witness in the world as representatives of God and Jesus are related to how we understand who Jesus is and what Jesus' significance is for the world, and particularly for the church. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, a lot.
I just wanted to, for the credo, make sure I understood this right. So you said it's not a matter of cutting and pasting, but my understanding was that you gave us feedback on the methodology and the Christology. So we would, of course, edit according to that feedback, but that would go into the credo. I mean,
Yes.
I'm planning on cutting and pasting that into the credo and basically creating an introduction, transitional sections, and then a third section on another topic, correct?
Yes, but it is also entwined with each other. So it's not just taking this paper out and laying it down. I've given you some feedback, but I want you to reread it and to think about, okay, if this is the way I understand who Jesus is, because you've written that, how does that impact the way I'm going to understand whatever topic you're choosing? So what do you know what topic third topic you're going to choose?
Probably like the sin and evil.
Sin and evil. So how are you going to phrase, and not phrase, but how you're going to construct your section on sin and evil then needs to find a correlation in some way with how you've understood who Jesus is.
Yeah.
Because you can say sin is, we're all violent and we need to stop being violent. And then Jesus is all about strength and power. Like, well, so that they need to be correlated. That's what I'm saying. So that they're not just sections unrelated to each other.
Yeah.
But there's correlation.
Yeah.
Right.
It still needs to be a full one paper that.
Yeah. It's one
Right.
paper that's integrated with each other. I mean, clearly, I want you to use the elements of the insights that you've had and what you've written in the other two papers, but it's not just cut and paste.
Right, not cut and paste in the pejorative sense where it literally that's all you do. Obviously, you're going to you've already been writing this throughout the whole semester in a sense, but now it's time to finally, use that as a base so you don't have to worry about the hard part of just starting with nothing. And now it's time to reread it, edit it, take your feedback into it, make it into a cohesive whole. Rather than just so don't copy and paste and just literally that's all you do. But obviously you're going to start with what you've already written, and now it's time to not just add transitional sections but make them flow into each other. And so it comes out, especially if one's thought has changed around these issues, so you could have your later papers influence your earlier ones as you're rewriting parts of them. It now becomes its own cohesive entity. That makes sense.
Thank you, Jared. All right. So what I'd like to do is there any other questions about that process? Because this is going to be due next week. So I want to make sure you have an opportunity to, if you have any questions, to for us to be able to discuss those. Everybody good then? All right. Yeah, okay. So now we've already discussed spirit, and we've looked at that. You recall we talked about that in terms of the immanent Trinity, or the ontological Trinity, and the economic Trinity. So there's two different ways of thinking about the Trinity. The first one is about the internal relationality within God, within the persons of the Trinity, and the way that they relate in and with each other. And then the second one, the economic Trinity, describes the parallel relationality of the way that the Spirit of God, relates with the world. So, and we've talked a little bit about the Spirit both being understood as wisdom or Sophia, as it incarnates in a spiritual or non-personal or non-individual person in the world, within and throughout human interactions of love and wisdom. So this week, we're going to explore how that Spirit, the Holy Spirit, engages with the community of believers in understanding the church more fully and more specifically, both historically and currently, but mostly in terms of its practices, the church's practices, sacraments, liturgy, And so we're going to reach into this, how the church is in some ways a realized eschatology. So an eschatology is, I should love that word, eschatological. I remember first hearing that word and I loved it, eschatological. Yes, and then some people say eschatology and other people say eschatology, right? So it's just fun to say. Anyway, so we're going to also talk a little bit about the eschatology of our two main authors, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that with Williamson on the last day of last things. So this hope for community of heaven, that we see it as both something that's hoped for, as particularly with Cone, we see it as something that's hoped for, and yet doing what we can and living in the way that will bring the elements of the hope for community, beloved community, into our current experience and world. So first, we're going to talk about Cone's, as I just mentioned, his theology of church and ministry and eschatology, and there'll be a little bit there on his understanding of spirit. And then we'll move to Williamson's view of church and ministry. And then Chance, as in a person, Chance will have a chance to lead us in our final discussion starter for the semester. Oh, that felt good. Okay, so let us begin. I've got a PowerPoint for us. And let me make sure I can, in case Chance has a PowerPoint at some point, make sure that's, here we go. Can everybody see that? All right, great. So I gotta move you all. So James Cone. So we're going to talk about James Cone's. Hard to see what you see it. How about that? Yeah, there we go. And his last chapter really there on the church and eschatology. Oops. Sorry, you all are in the space where I need to. Okay, how about that? All right, now I can't see you. So if you have any questions or need to say anything, please unmute yourself, so it doesn't simply feel like I'm talking to myself looking into a computer dot, which is what it feels like right now. But so the participation in, so for Cone, this is the first, yes, okay. For Cone, the church is a community of Jesus's liberating work. Liberation is really important for Cone. That's the main goal and participating activity that the church is about. It is the primary characteristic of the church. He talks about 3 tasks of the church. And this is parallel with many ways of people have talked about the church. There's a proclamation of the church. The church is called to proclaim the good news. It's called to actively share in bringing about the good news. And it is a way of living in community of liberation. So the first one, proclaiming the reality of divine liberation. And it is, so the church is proclaiming that this is what God's view is, this is what God's goal is, this is what God's hope is for the liberation of all people, the liberation that we live with freedom, we live in freedom, and we are not caught in the struggle of racism, we're not caught in the struggle of oppression. And the proclamation of that the church also proclaims that this is what the world is supposed to be, that we're supposed to be free. Now, we might think about what do we mean by freedom there, and I think that's would be an interesting focal point for us to reflect upon, because Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther talks about Christian freedom in a different way. Freedom of a Christian has to do with being aligned with God's or Christ's will. But I think Cone would not dispute that, but he's understanding in a very particular way. And it has to do with the struggle for earthly liberation. So the church is also about a community of people that are actively engaged in this struggle and participating and encouraging and inspiring others to also engage in the struggle for liberation. For Cone, he talks about, he refers to Matthew's, the first shall be last and last shall be first. For him, the gospel is very much a political and economic reality, not to be separated from the world in the way that sometimes churches are. Church is also about living in fellowship. And this is a visual, a live, if you will, manifestation of the gospel, Christ existing as a community. And we might reflect on that and think about Jesus's disciples. And that's the foundation of this, but it also extends beyond that to what does it mean to live as a community? Talk a little bit about that with those of you who've studied early church history or even late New Testament. It's actually early New Testament thought, but in terms of when it's written, Paul in the letters, and how are the early church communities living? How are the early church communities getting along with each other? Are they working together to live as a community? I mean, I think we can understand many of the letters that Paul writes to the different Christian communities throughout a fairly large area, even beyond Israel, even beyond what we think of as the land of Israel. But how are people figuring out how to live in a community, live as a community? The church attends to the suffering in the world. So Cone is particularly concerned about that the church is a place where those who are suffering can come and be accepted and be cared for. And also the church is about equipping those people as members of the church to go out and help persons who are suffering, but also to help each other within. So there's an internal and there's internal community, but there's also outreach. The church is also not only participating with those who are suffering, but it's also representing Christ's redemptive work in the world. So as I said, it's both engaging those who are suffering in a healing way and in a liberating way, but also representing that Christ is redeeming the world. So it's both of those, internal and external. And persons will be, according to Cone here, he's highlighting Matthew, persons will be received or rejected according to how they treated those in need. We all remember that in Matthew. Now he also talks about eschatology or last things. That's what the term often means, last things. But there's also, which he doesn't use the term realized eschatology, but he does talk about the theme. And so I'm naming it as realized eschatology because that's the way I would understand it, given my background. So it's about, realized eschatology is about making the not yet of heaven, the not yet of what we hope for, what we're hoping the world will be, what we're hoping the spirit will be, what we're hoping this community of inclusive and loving and liberating persons will be, this community, if it were idealized, right? The not yet, making it more present in the now. This includes a critique of the focus on future fulfillment. So instead of talking about, well, in the by and by, things will be better. I'm suffering now on earth, but in heaven, I'll be fine. Everything will be great and I'll have a great place in heaven. Instead of focusing on that future fulfillment, he wants to refocus our attention to bringing the fulfillment of liberation now into this current life, into our way of living right now. But it's not just, for Cone, it's not just about, it's not just political work. Right? It includes political work, but the political work without the theological vision isn't adequate. the theological vision in what one imagines as a pastor and as a person, a leader in the Christian work, is what would it be like for heaven, and how can we bring those values, those images, those ways of being in the world into the world now. So, for example, when he talks about, Cone talks about the Bible, so people long for this coming of the Lord because they're oppressed, and they long for promised liberation. And then in the Hebrew Bible, we get some liberation, we get some promise. The promised land is there. People get to the promised land eventually, and it really doesn't become what they'd hoped it would be, but the hope is still there. There's little bits of the eschatology being realized. And he highlights the way that this realized eschatology is seen in the theologians of hope, like Moltmann and Pannenberg, and this eschatology promises that things can be different, and they can be different in the here and now. We don't have to just wait until the by and by, right? But that has to happen with our attention to action, with this image toward a future, toward changing toward that future. Eschatology is a protest against the injustice that's here and now, and proclaims the need for a revolutionary change. Any questions about any of this? Okay, I don't see anybody making any noises or saying anything. All right. I see a man in a suit that is not, are you there? Yes, okay, you're there. You're captivated, aren't you? Okay. So the eschatological hope is about life on earth. God is only for me as I am a part of the community of God. And God is only allows me to be a part of the community of God as I protest the injustice that is in the current world. We know what the end is, this image, this vision we have of the future. When we face it head on by refusing at the risk of death to tolerate the present injustice. There's a little existentialism here in Cone. One of his other books that I used to use in the intro to theology before I had to change it to a different format was The Risk of Faith that Cone talks about. The risk of faith, which is to risk. Faith calls us to take the risk and to stand up and say, I refuse, to say, no, I'm not going to be a part of the injustice anymore. And one is empowered to do that with hope, through hope. And that hope is grounded upon God. Hope must be related to the present. It can't just be a hope for something that has, it must be related to the present, must be grounded in our understanding of the present, in our being in the present, and along with the inspiration of our imagination to envision a future, so that it can be the means of transforming the oppressed community into a liberated one and to a liberating one. We start from where we are to be able to envision where we want to go. The belief is that something can be done to change. As he says, to believe in heaven is to refuse to accept hell on earth. One other quote I particularly liked is, if God is the God of and for the oppressed, for the purpose of their liberation, the future must mean that our fight has not been for naught. So any responses to that?
I think the idea that your hope is both something present that you are actively working on, and that it's in God, which is somehow beyond ourselves and our work I think that's a challenging thing for most churches and people to kind of, I think we kind of fall into one or the other, either relying on God and not doing the work ourselves and saying, oh, well, God will do this, or falling into over time, like anxiety and despair because we are not seeing the work be realized and not able to trust that God will realize it. So.
That's really helpful. It reminds me of Niebuhr, and Cohn references Niebuhr, but one of the things that Niebuhr says that I find so powerful is anything worth changing cannot actually be chosen in one lifetime. I mean, cannot actually be changed in one lifetime. Anything worth changing, anything devoting your life to anything worth devoting your life to change cannot be changed within one lifetime. In this way, the commitment then is to the community of faith that picks up where others left off. And in some ways, the reward, so to speak, not that there is necessarily a reward, like I don't mean like your heavenly reward or something. I mean that which keeps your energy from falling into despair is that the baton can be taken up by the next generation, working toward the similar goal of a realized eschatology. It may shift, right? Because it's got more to do with God than it has to do with us in many ways. So we can envision what it is we think the realized kingdom of God would be like, but we can only, our vision is limited by the scope of our vision. So we work to move forward, to protest the injustice here and now, in hopes that our children and grandchildren will have less injustice to protest, and that God continues to transform this world. Any other comments on Cohn? Then I'll move to Williamson. Can you all see Williamson? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so and Williamson has a section here on what's going on in some ways. These are like the nuts and bolts of the church. Like his earlier chapter was on the Spirit and how the Spirit incarnates into a community and is present in the community. And this chapter is more about what happens in that community as we experience it, and how do we interpret what's happening in that community? What are what's the software we have at our disposal? And that includes the word and the sacraments. That includes means of grace. How does the church communicate the means of grace? And it's not that grace is limited to what the church communicates or to these particular means of grace, but these are means of grace that the community over the past 2,000 years has engaged and experienced. So they've become more powerful as we continue to do them over and over and over again, realizing that we are joining ourselves with other Christians, other persons of faith that have done similar things, maybe not exactly the same, but similar things in some ways. We've said the creed. People have been saying the creed for how many years, in how many different languages. I mean, I get that idea. I find that idea also present in the importance of the Book of Common Prayer. And as an Episcopalian, so there's a morning office. And so there's, it's 15 minutes or so of a morning office. There's morning prayers. Every day has its own prayer. Every day has its own structure. It's fairly similar day to day, but it's slightly different. At every moment of time, somebody is praying the office. And that feels very comforting for those of us that might, particularly during this pandemic, to know that even though I'm praying by myself, I'm praying the office by myself, somebody somewhere is praying it as well. So the church, as I mentioned earlier, is about both the internal care, the care of the people in that community, but also outreach into the world. So the internal community is about caretaking and tending to the needs of the church, of the members of the church. For some churches, and this isn't in Williamson, but in my own church, because we're looking for a new pastor, we get some education about the different sizes of churches. So we're kind of between a community church and a bigger church. So the community church really is focused on the internal needs of the community. And the larger churches can also engage in more outreach and more social justice work. But so we're kind of in the middle. We have big ideas about social justice. We don't have enough people to really do both of those kinds of things well. So, I mean, it's an interesting way of thinking about this as you're becoming pastors, or some of you are already ministers, how your church fits into this paradigm, or this structure of analyzing it. It may be the case, it may be true, it may not be true. This is what the diocese tells us, but I think it makes sense. So there's both the internal caretaking, and just speaking from my own experience, many churches have a lot of older people, and during COVID have had a lot of people that are either sick or are isolated from others. Their structures of community have been broken or reduced, and so that the community outreach within the community has become, I think, particularly important for folks. How do we care for people who are suffering? They've lost a child to COVID, or their partner has become suddenly deathly ill. People have lost their jobs. How do we attend to their physical needs? Those kinds of questions, I think, are often important, but they don't usually get talked about theologically. So I'm encouraging you to think about those theologically. What does it mean then to care for the community, to care for the parish? Then there's also the outreach, right? The proclaiming the gospel, the care for the needy outside of the church, the social justice for the community at large, for the nation at large. Participating with other members of other churches or religious organizations, or other organizations maybe that aren't religious, in how can we help fix some problems that are going on in our community. How do we participate? How do we make changes? How does the church participate in that? So we'll talk a little bit in a moment about the sacraments. We can think of those as acts of commitment. These are outward signs for inward grace, of course, but they are ways in which we both act to claim our commitment, to show our commitment, to embody that commitment. And there are also ways that we can be inspired toward that commitment and be built up. Those of you who took Intro to Theology with me remember Kierkegaard talking about love. Christian love is love that builds up. It builds from what's already there. We are already loved and we're already capable of love. And Christian love builds on that. And the sacraments then also build on those, build on that love, build on that grace that's already present with us. The primary sacraments that we'll talk about are baptism and the Lord's Prayer, or the Lord's Supper, sorry, or Eucharist. And then there's also the sacraments of ministry, ordination, prayer, other kinds of, maybe they're called sacraments in your tradition, maybe they're not. And we also see the church as a community of memory and a community of hope. And I encourage you to think about that. What does the community of memory mean? In our church, we have All Saints, because we're called All Saints. We also have All Souls. So our community of memories, and we're Episcopalian. So being a saint, you don't have to commit. You don't have to perform a miracle. So there are people that are canonized for other reasons, in addition to anybody that might have performed a miracle. And that's really, those are a community of memory. And then we have All Souls Day the same next day, right? And that's a community of memory, because we all become saints eventually. This communion of the saints is such a powerful element in my church in particular. And then there's the community of hope, what we hope for, how we hope that we too can become a saint too. You know, that song, well, singing about the saints, and that we too can someday become a saint. But there's also this notion of the community of hope that is about the changing of the world, the changing of our community, the changing, bringing the kingdom of God and God's values into the world. So the church is a community that is called out from ordinary living. Now I'm moving into Williamson. And this church right here, this is the Christ Church Cathedral in downtown Indianapolis, which is the Episcopal Church. And I like the picture. I mean, I like it too, because it's right in the middle of downtown and there's big, tall buildings all around it. It's not out in the prairie, away from the world. It's right in the midst of the world. And we are called to come be a part of this community, out of our ordinary living, out of our world where we are, right where we are. We're called to become the people of God, set toward the goal of bringing of God's reign, right? How do we enable God's reign to be present in the world? This is similar to what Cohn is talking about, bringing the values of heaven into the earth, into the church, into the world. Church is also about wrestling toward understanding God and God's purposes. Remember, the church's purpose, we're not about the church's purpose. Theology and what we're called to is not to serve the church's purpose. We're called to serve God's purposes in and through the church. Called to serve God's purposes in and through the church. We celebrate together. Now, the celebrate can be both the way we celebrate our Mass, the way we celebrate our communion, our Lord's Supper, but also celebrate life's events. We celebrate our marriages, we celebrate our birthdays, we celebrate, in some ways, celebrate doesn't seem the right word, but we come together to honor those who pass on to heaven. We come together to struggle together. We celebrate together in gratitude, and we celebrate this joy of God's gracious love. That God's gracious love not only empowers us to love more deeply and more fully and more perfectly, but it also forgives us when we fail. The church also invites others to participate in the well-being of God's blessing. So Williamson is particularly concerned with the church not become an exclusive club. Like the club that's right next door to the church. If anybody knows, does anybody know the way that downtown Indianapolis is, right? So right next.
I wanted to say something about that because it's like literally connected to the building, isn't it? You have to walk by it to get to the church.
Yeah, you have to walk by what club is it? It's
like a country club or something, isn't it?
the
Columbia Club.
Columbia Club. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. When I first was here, there was two clubs. One was for the Democrats, one was for the Republicans, and the Columbia Club is for the Republicans. I don't know how that works out now because Democrats and Republicans are completely different than they're not completely, but the whole thing is, I don't really know. And since there isn't a liberal country club anymore, so to speak. Yeah, so I don't think there's a physical connect. I mean, there's a physical connection in that their walls are right next to each other. And it might be that the Christchurch Cathedral uses the parking lot that the Columbia Club has. Because there's not a lot of places to park, they might have made an agreement like that. But it is interesting to note that it invites others to participate, being in the world, but not of the world. And I think it's a great example of, so the part of I don't know if that's just a reflection. I think it's just over here where you get to the Columbia Club. Oops, okay. The church also has, or the church does have means of grace, which are sacraments. These are the way we say yes to God, according to Williamson. There's preaching, there's baptism, there's the breaking of the bread together, there's prayer, and there's ministry. God is immediately present to us in, with, and under the sacraments, these means of grace. Are there other means of grace in your tradition?
So the United Methodist Church has public and piety, or public and personal pieties, and personal and public. So let me just put it into plain words.
Yeah.
They have ways of doing devotions as well as service personally, and then ways of doing devotion in service publicly. So the means of personal piety might be daily prayers and reading scripture by yourself. Personal mission might be giving alms. Public missions might be giving or helping at a food pantry. It might be handing out Christmas toys, if you will. And public devotions then would be church service or Christian conferencing or Bible studies, that type of thing. And sacraments, of course.
Thank you, Amber, for sharing that. Other means of grace, whether they're named as sacraments or not?
I mean, I didn't know, I didn't know if I saw it on the PowerPoint or not, but I mean, like specifically even at All Saints, we have, unction specifically with anointing people with oil. And, even if that, and even if one's not expecting that, to just kind of, magically heal some condition, it's the idea that we're there for you and we're praying for you. And even if it might not physically always take the pain away or take whatever you're going through away, it can help you have a new perspective on it, or at least, how would I say, persevere through it, or kind of live into it in a way you couldn't before. I mean, I literally just took a semester long or an intensive on the sacraments. I'm trying to remember the specific example Professor Regenerator gave us about a prisoner he had with Parkinson's disease. But you know, obviously, if anything, his condition has sadly, you know, worsened over time as it's definitive. Oh yeah, go on ahead, Zach.
He did, if I remember correctly, he placed his hand on the person with the condition he was praying for, and he said, correct me if I'm wrong, Jared, I think he said he physically felt that illness come out of the person and into him.
I think you're talking. He did say that he was talking about like a girl that had a fever or something like that.
That's what it was. Yeah, the fever.
Yeah, he was talking. This is more of like, this was like the last class. He was talking about a parishioner of his that has Parkinson's. So, you know, it's been degenerating over time. But I forget how he worded it, but he said like he even told him personally, like praying for him and kind of doing unction as a pastor has made him be able to have a better outlook on it, even as his physical condition has worsened, his spiritual condition has actually grown. So something like that. He stated it far better.
So deviating from the focus on sacraments just for a moment, I think it's interesting to reflect upon the difference between healing and cure. And I think of cure as something that the doctors, that the people who have medical degrees work toward, and healing is something more that pastors and other persons are enabled, called toward. Healing has, I think, is more of an internal. I mean, one can still have Parkinson's and yet experience healing. Healing also is, I think, knowing one is not alone. And also I think, how do I say this? It's not just, and I don't mean to sound glib, but finding a way to help a person who is suffering to accept the suffering, not be fighting against it or thinking it's somehow a punishment or something like that, but to accept oneself as one is, as a child of God in the midst of who one is at the moment. So healing is more internal, can have some psychological elements to it as well, but and I think extreme unction is done at that, or unction is done at that time. The anointing of people, which we used to do before COVID. We haven't done that in a while. But then there's also the rite of passage into death. That one is extreme unction for that as well. Other sacraments or means of grace that people might share.
I was just going to say, I appreciated what Williamson said on page 280. It sounds like kind of a caution against being too literal with, you know, some traditions say the only thing that can be a sacrament is what Jesus specifically instituted. But Williamson points out that Jesus instructed the disciples to do other things that never have been officially considered a sacrament, like to pray. And also there are things that we think it's beneficial to do that Jesus didn't specifically command. I like his example of building a house for the poor. I'm not sure that in the Gospels it ever says that Jesus said, go build a house for the poor. You know, it was more general, take care of them, but not go build them a house. And I suppose if you're too literal, you'll say, we can't be building a house for the poor because the Lord did not specifically institute that as something that we should do. So anyway, I thinking more broadly about what it is and how it works was meaningful to me.
Thank you for sharing that. Can you hear that? No, okay, you can hear that? Can you hear that? That's my clock. It's a bird. It's not really a bird. It's a clock. Okay.
I wondered where it was coming from. I didn't realize it was Nice
I thought maybe you could hear it because Amber went, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of another practice that often isn't considered a sacrament, but in many ways, Jesus did, and it's even customary still to celebrate during certain times of the year, but it's foot washing, right? And I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, do you know, is it Brethren churches that still do Brethren, or
I think most Anabaptists
okay?
would say foot washing is still a pretty big deal. But
Well-
the primitive Baptists do foot washing with their communion once a year.
Okay, well, I'm just talking about like as a very regular thing, because I mean, sure, you have during Lent and Holy
Well,
Week.
Church of the Brethren only do communion once a year too. So
Okay, yeah.
so
But,
they
yeah,
also
just giving an
would-
example.
but they do foot washing, yeah.
No, I wonder about hymns, singing hymns or singing gospel songs. I think some people certainly have the same experience. I can speak to myself speak for myself that I think some of the hymns they're very powerful, and I definitely feel God's presence when we're singing them. There's a few of them that I still can't get through without crying, but certainly feel the presence of God in and with me, in me, and with the people when we're singing. It's very different. I mean, I've got recordings, right? And I can listen to that and I can sort of be remembering that. But when I'm actually in the congregation and we're singing together, that's very powerful.
This wasn't a denominational practice, but and I don't know if all hospitals do this, but where I did CPE, we could hand out prayer shawls to people who are like, especially if people approaching end of life or who just had like longer hospital stays. And I know that's like sort of connected to prayer, like we would pray with the person, but leaving behind that physical reminder and care, because these were all like hand knit and donated to the hospital by like local faith communities.
Yeah, and I thank you for giving that as an example. Yeah, our straw group does that. Yeah, as well. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Let me see. Let me go back to this. Williamson talks about the purpose of the church as a community of God's people. And I don't know if you can see this or not. You probably can because you're on your computers, but these are people standing there and there's somebody's taking a picture, maybe they're drawing, I don't know, but to make the image of the church with the people. You've all seen that. This is the church and this is the steeple, and open the doors and see all the people. Nobody laughed. Okay. You remember doing that when you were a little kid, I'm sure. Some of you did. Anyway, so the church is basically a community of people. And the church also is about proclaiming and preaching God's love, justice, and grace. That's very similar to what Cone said earlier. And it's also about teaching the ways of love and forgiveness and shalom. Remember, shalom is this peace of well-being for all. The purpose of the church is also to extend God's way of life and well-being to include others, and it is ever growing. Salvation, Williamson insists, is not exclusive. It is not limited to members of the church. And then we talk about means of grace. There's the invisible word. That includes the means of grace of preaching and teaching. This was Martin Luther talked about word and sacrament. And some of you probably have heard that before, word and sacrament. Before Martin Luther, the discussion about word was not seen as a sacrament. Preaching was not named as a sacrament, did not function in that way. Although some folks have argued that it actually did, it just wasn't named. as being a sacrament or functioning in a sacramental way. That the word, the preaching of the word actually can function in a sacramental way, that the word confronts us, the word comes to us, the word comforts us, the word shares our pain with us. I don't know if any of you have had this experience in a sermon or church setting where someone is speaking and it feels like they're speaking directly to me. And I know that I've talked to other people who are preachers, and they get feedback that they felt like through the sermon that God was speaking to them directly, and they'll name what it is they thought was being said to them. And you can have 5 different people who heard 5 different messages. And in some ways, the way to articulate that, or to way to understand that, interpret that, is the word is speaking to the people as they need it. It is the self-disclosure of God's love, to focus on the one element that is particularly meaningful for that person then. So it is the process of preaching, the experience of preaching, which always includes a listener, a receiver of the word, and a proclaimer of the word, that is, like we talked about last week, about the Spirit, meaning that the 70 were sent out by Jesus in pairs so that they can be the Spirit for each other. And in some ways, the preaching and teaching is like that, where God's love is disclosed to us in and through the sermon, through the preaching. This love is appropriated by faith. And Williamson is insistent that we understand ourselves as both sinner and saved. We are both sinner and saved. There aren't some folks that are sinners and some folks that are saved. That all people are both sinner and saved. Now, he wouldn't deny that he thinks, or he thought, that some people were bigger sinners than others, but we're all both sinner and saved. He goes on to talk about the way we understand ourselves in relation to God, Jesus Christ, and our neighbor. This is what preaching and teaching engages us in, reflecting upon that. The pastoral role of preaching also includes caring for the congregation in times of grief and suffering, as well as demonstrating what it is to live as a child of God with others who are also children of God. So the pastor has a lot of work to do. Pastor's got a lot of roles to fill. Thankfully, the pastor is not alone, neither individually as people, nor spiritually, since God is present. Since being ordained is a sacrament, God is present in the pastor. And then there is also the visible word. And these are the sacraments that most folks talk about in terms of sacraments. I wish that wasn't there. Okay, I can't really read it. All right. So the baptism and Eucharist. So these are the 2 main sacraments in most Protestant churches. And baptism and Eucharist both, or Last Supper, reenact something that happens in the gospel. They reenact the gospel out of God's deepest being. Baptism is the initiation, introducing us into the covenant of salvation. And it entails a break with the old person who was a sinner, and a rebirth into the community of believers. Now, one of the questions that, and I'll ask this in just a moment, but one of the questions that often arises is one to be baptized as an adult or a baby? Is one to be baptized as one is coming into adulthood, or should the baby be baptized when it's a few days old? So in the Roman tradition, babies are often baptized just as quickly as they're born, because the notion is that babies are born with the original sin, and the baptism takes away the original sin. In other traditions, people are baptized only when they become a believer. They can be old enough to say, I am the one who believes, and so I want to become part of this church and this community. And in some traditions, one must be baptized in order for one to receive the Eucharist, to receive the Lord's Supper. I know my mother used to get in trouble because back in the day, the church had, I would say, stricter morale. All right, I'll just say moralities, as opposed to ethics, right? Where if you were an unwed mother, you weren't allowed to receive communion, and you had to have been baptized, and you had to gone through a course or a series of classes. And my mother got in trouble for giving communion to an unmarried pregnant woman. And she proclaimed, my mother proclaimed, that the only requirement is that you revere Christ. There isn't a requirement for being baptized. There isn't a requirement for having gone through a series of classes. Now, the Episcopal Church would argue that you have to be baptized and you have to go through a tradition. I mean, not tradition, you have to go through a series of classes so that you know what you're getting into. And I'm sure the different people in this class have different ideas, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So be thinking about your traditions and what they mean in your particular denomination or your particular church community. The Eucharist is also something that has caused some disagreements and squabbles among Christians. Probably most of us would say, well, the biggest difference between the Catholics and the non-Catholics is the Catholics believe that Jesus is really present in the communion, in the bread, truly present, that Christ's body is present in the bread, whereas Methodists do not. The other difference may be that Catholics use wine and Methodists use grape juice. Did anybody ever notice that the biggest producer of grape juice is Welch? And Welch was a great Methodist. And, you know, the Methodists didn't use grape juice until Prohibition, till Welch came along. But anyway, the Eucharist is seen as a renewing and a nourishing of our spirit and our incorporation into God's body. So it's about how we become part of Christ's body, and it's about a renewing of our spirit as we are part of Christ's body. So some folks would say that the baptism is the initiation and the communion is the renewal of that commitment, of that covenant, of that cleansing of the baptism. So in communion, in Eucharist, what's said is, this is my body. And Williamson highlights that Christ then is present with us in the element, right? Christ is present. It's not this was my body or this can pretend to be my body. It's this is my body. So there's a presentness, an impresenting, so to speak. Williamson is emphatic that I've got something on the bottom here and I can't get to it. So somebody else is going to have to read it. So Williamson is emphatic that the Lord's Supper is a gracious gift and persons cannot be barred from receiving it on the basis of sexual orientation, race, class, denomination, etc.
He also insists that we must also feed the hungry. That's the last point.
Oh, thank you. So Williamson puts these two connected. The Lord's Supper also is a inspiration and a teaching ordinance that we must, as we receive the Lord's Supper, we are also commanded to feed the hungry. So I've got these two images here. There are a variety of ways of understanding Eucharist and baptism, and so I'm going to ask you to reflect upon this in your own tradition. But I invite you to, I just want to say that what happens in the Episcopal Church, and I know Jared goes to All Saints, and other people might have been in an Episcopal Church as well. But what happens, and we had to move our baptistry to the back of our church so that this would line up. So the idea here is that when you come into the church, the church's entrance is on the west side of the building, and you look to the east. And as you come into the church, you look and you see the baptismal font, and in a line with it is the altar where the Eucharist is or will be. And then either the cross or the crucifix is above that. There's a straight line from the west to the east. And you can see this is similar here. This is a Lutheran symbol here of the Spirit and the cross and the communion.
Russell, you said you had to move your baptistry. Where was it before?
No, we had to move it. We were told to move it. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know that we were told
From
you can't, if you don't move it, you're not in charge, you're not in the church anymore. But it was encouraged that we move it. Yes. Oh, hi, Matthias.
I was wondering. What
Hello.
was it before?
Everyone.
Yes, Reagan.
So I was just wondering, where was it before? Where it was?
It was on the north side. When you came in that door, there's an old one there. Jared, you've probably seen it. It was over there. So you would come in. So, and there would be the aisle into the where the altar was, or the table, and then the cross, and then it was over on the north side. It wasn't lined up, so we had to move it.
I'm not trying to get off.
That's okay.
I guess that's my question. So what changed? Because how long had it been on the north side before it was realized that it was out of alignment and needed to be moved?
I don't know.
That's what I'm asking.
I don't know. I mean, it was moved for a theological reason and because we got a different bishop. And so the bishop said, this is what because to have the architecture fit the theology. So the theology was always there in the Episcopal Church, but the architecture wasn't fitting it. And I don't know why it was put over there to begin with. There did used to be where you would go and make confession, which would make sense that there would be a baptismal font right outside of where you would go to take confession, because you would want to. In the Episcopal Church, we remember our baptismal. We remember our baptism as we come into the church and go out of the church. So we dip our hand in the little things of water. So there's little things of water on all the doors, and it would make sense that because people maybe came in that way, there's a door right there. But the idea is that there is an alignment here. I mean, it's an interesting theological idea that the baptism through the body of the church to the altar or the table where the communion is, and then the cross or the crucifix.
Does the direction have a theological implication too? You mentioned east and west as opposed to north and
Yes.
south.
Yes, so we look to the rising of the sun. One might think about that in a variety of different ways. The rising of the sun, the resurrection of the sun, the rising of the the sunrise, yeah.
Right. I wondered if there was that connection, because I used to work as a burial vault installer, which means I put people in the ground, and everybody's feet is facing either east or south, depending on the direction of the cemetery. And that's
Yeah,
for that reason, for the rising of the sun on the last day.
yeah.
Everybody. So nobody's backflipping out of their grave. They're all.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. And when we do have a body, the coffin comes in head first, and then when it's at the end of the funeral mass, it's turned around so that it comes out head first as well.
Right. If it helps, Zach, praying towards the east is a very old Christian custom. It might even go back to Second Temple Judaism in terms of praying towards Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Not exactly known where it started, but it's generally assumed to be kind of like pray towards the rising sun, which I guess there's kind of even an ancient pun in that with the sun rising as well. And, hence why you see a lot of churches oriented that way. And why, pre-Vatican II, mass is always conducted, everybody, including the priest, faces the east. And when they started being more, relaxed or encouraging people to face the priest to face the people, there's controversy around that because it's like, no, it has to be towards the east. That's how it's always been done. So there you go.
Thanks for that.
If I know that might be something you've already heard of before, but so
In general, in that vein, yeah.
There is an interesting, my priest, back when I was in California, he gave a sermon once, and this is a long time ago, so I'm remembering it from memory. But I remember when he took the communion cup, and the communion cup is a chalice, and he held the bread with the chalice, and he said, "Do you ever think," this is during the sermon, "when I'm standing there holding the communion and I look into your eyes and I say, the body of Christ, I'm not talking about the bread." It was I found that really powerful. That connection. I realize that different folks have different practices in your traditions, and usually this is the part of the class where everybody disagrees with everybody. I mean, everybody can sort of be like, oh, okay, I understand your view of sin, or I understand your view of Jesus, but no, you cannot be baptized as an adult. So I'm open to any conversation anybody wants to have, any questions, or if you want to share what your tradition is or what your church community does.
I just find it interesting because Jared and I have been talking about this all semester with our sacraments class, and our final paper has to do with dealing with the 5 that are usually under question of whether or not they're a sacrament or not. And I'm finding as I go along that there are some places within the United Methodist liturgy and tradition that they feel very sacramental if they're not sacraments. There's almost, I find myself arguing for the legitimacy of some of these being more sacrament, as an actual sacrament rather than just sacramental in nature.
Can you give more content to that? So let's make sure everybody's on the same board. What are the sacraments?
Well, you got the 2 common sacraments, which are Eucharist and baptism, and then you have fill me in if I miss one, Jared. Marriage, extreme unction, which is anointing. I was going to forget when I had them written down, so I didn't.
Ordination.
Ordination. Thank you. Orders. I can just pull it up on I have my
and
paper.
confirmation.
Confirmation and confession, penance.
Marriage. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Luther thought there should just be the 3: baptism, communion, and penance, because he talks about priesthood of all believers. So there is an ordination. Little girl was asked that question once, and she simply said 7 for boys and 6 for girls. Of course, in the Episcopal Church, we ordain them male, female. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so do we. But I was finding going back through the history of the denomination, I found the nature of the class and band meetings felt very much like confession and penance, because the thing that you had to do that every week or you weren't a Methodist. Like that was a requirement that John Wesley put on Methodists. So it felt very well, if you're having to do it that often, and if it's something that's a pivotal part of your faith formation, that sounds a whole lot like a sacrament, especially when we're called to repent and confess our sins by John and Jesus. So there's
I love the way you said that. John and Jesus. John's the
there's
most
more than
important.
one that says it.
Well, but
Sounds
along
like-
those same lines, though, within our liturgies for sacrament is a community confession.
Yeah. And the thing is, we give, when we baptize, we give thanks over the water in very much this, which is a sacrament in the Methodist Church, but we do the same thing with oil when we do like a healing service. It's a thanksgiving over the oil instead of the water, which again feels very sacramental. And yet at the same time, we're saying, no, that's not a sacrament. So it's kind of like the love feast versus the Holy Communion. It just
And
feels.
how is that like distinguished again? Like, how do they decide what is a means of grace and what's not a means of grace?
I think Sarah's asking back, right?
Whether or not Christ specifically said do it. So, I'm sorry, what? Say it again, I'm breaking up, I'm sorry.
So I think we're talking about two different things here. John Wesley, for instance, had means of grace were not just sacraments. Sacraments were included as a means of grace, but they were not solely the means of grace. So the means of grace are just ways that help you grow in a relationship with God through Jesus. And it's a variety of different, pretty common Christian practices that you would think of.
Yeah, my apologies, Sarah Lynn. I couldn't hear, my internet keeps busting up. So yeah, as Amber said, there's different means of grace, not just sacraments. So like scripture, worship, all those things are considered to be part of the means of grace.
And so it's just a sacrament if Jesus, for the Methodists, it's a sacrament if Jesus commanded that they do it.
Right.
I always like I grew up in a non-denominational tradition that, we took communion occasionally and baptized, and we just don't remember them talking about sacraments, like using the term sacrament and yeah, I'm in Disciples of Christ. So obviously we take communion every week. And what I appreciate is I kind of, at some point, came to the conclusion that you should practice believers' baptism, but communion should be open. So you should have an open table and closed baptism. But but I don't know. I think I still have just that more low church view generally. So I love the joke that the potluck is sacrament for Baptists, a sacrament for Baptists or whatever. Yeah, I won't get into the theology part. I guess I'm not sure if I've totally worked it out in my head yet, but.
Right. And I think part of it is also kind of the historical angle. And I'm getting, and at least, especially from what I understand, especially the Methodists are ultimately drawing it not only from Wesley's writings, but also from the 39 articles. So there's in Anglicanism. So for example, our great kind of Reformation era compromise on this was the article that, okay, there are the 5 so-called sacraments that are historically practiced by the church, but they're not practiced consistently all places and everywhere, versus these 2, which we could find being commanded to do, and we could find pretty much being present everywhere. And that becomes, Eucharist and baptism being the sacraments for the Church of England, and then kind of allowing one wiggle room on the other five to where, if you're like me, you're more Anglo-Catholic, you're high up there, you're going to say, oh yeah, all of what are called the seven sacraments or sacraments, or you could be more reformed or more evangelical about it and just go for the two and say the other five are great, but we wouldn't really they can't be seen as commanded by Holy Writ or proved by Holy Writ to take the quote the text itself from the article. I forget which article it is, but maybe that gives you some context. God, I was going to say something else, but I completely spaced out on it. But I think part of it really also has to go to the history of just a lot of in the Western Church, these Reformation era debates around the word sacrament that have gotten so heated and so, shed blood quite many times, that I think denominations that functionally do treat them as sacraments sometimes shy away from that, understanding of it, or just putting the verb there. And likewise, the ones that do tend to keep more of the sacramental theology kind of, turn their noses up at everybody else, even though they basically practice the same thing. They just might call it something different. So again, my personal opinion though. So
I think there's a variety of behaviors or actions or experiences that people have within various Christian churches that function in sacramental ways, whether they're called sacraments or not. And, I think hymns and prayers and community praying, when people can, intercessory prayer, us Episcopalians, we've got a prayer for everything. It's written in the book. We've got a prayer for everything. Let me just look up where that is. Whereas there are other folks that do prayer just being inspired by it. And, I think it's interesting to reflect on the different ways that people, to me, I don't think one's better than the other. I think there's just different experiences that fit different people's both history and their culture or their comfort, personal comfort. Any other comments?
I kind of had this conversation in my, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
We had this similar conversation in my formation to ministry class. I'm Baptist, and so our denomination is a lot more loose, not hierarchical. We're autonomous, and so we don't even use the word sacrament. We rarely use it. We use the word ordinances, and those ordinances being baptism and communion. That's it. That's all. That was one of my ordination questions: how many ordinances are there in the Baptist Church? So we don't even use the word sacrament in the same way for that. So I don't know if we heard communion mentioned, and so it depends on that congregation whether it's open or closed. One thing we seem to agree on is baptism coming as a result of confession of faith, and not before. Anything prior to that is called or referred to as a dedication, as opposed to baptism. So yeah. And I guess I feel that to say that I'm jealous of all the structure that everybody else has, because we certainly don't have it that way, which is good and bad.
Yeah, again, I mean, that's how I like that term ordinance, because I'm just still not clear what the significance of a sacrament is when the means of grace is obviously goes well beyond like any particular sacrament. But it does make sense to say, well, Jesus ordered us to do these two things, so it's an ordinance. Yeah, so that's interesting to me.
yeah, but then I guess I worry that it almost makes it sound too much. And again, we discussed this in the sacraments class, but the term ordinance sometimes I fear it can make it sound too much like it's just a task or a duty and not something that's kind of its own reward, because sacrament, it, it evokes the sacred, and usually sacramentum from the Latin is usually just a translation of the original content, which is mysteria in Greek. So the divine mysteries, the that there is, even though God is obviously present in all things, and shows God's self to the church in various ways, that there's something special about how God becomes present in these actions, these specific actions that the church does and remembers and constantly orders its life around. That makes it more than just, obviously it's symbolic, but it makes it more than that. And it's certainly more than just something we do because we have to. But obviously it's not the only way God shows grace, but there's something about this that God makes God's grace kind of concretely known in a way that is deniable, I suppose.
I like the way you said that, just because, like, as you were talking, I thought, well, I believe that God is as present in anointing a person with oil as God is in putting water on a child or an adult. But as you say, it's something that we order our, the life of the church around, and we don't do anointing all the time. We do regularly practice communion, or most traditions normally practice communion. But yeah, I think that might just be that dividing line, that boundary, what we order the around.
My supervisor last year at supervised ministry, this is Lutheran context, gave this analogy that I thought was really helpful, and it stuck with me. He said that so the sacraments are not the only means of grace, but they're a sure means of grace. So his analogy was, let's say you're hungry. You can be sure that if you go to the refrigerator, you'll get food. Maybe somebody will come along and give you cake, but that's a maybe. But you know for sure that if you go to the refrigerator, you'll find food there.
The other thing, I appreciate that. That's nice, especially for those of us who do have food in our refrigerator. The other thing for me, and I'm not sure this feels experientially the case, but I'm not sure that it works with process theology. But to me, the sacraments, they work on you even when you're not conscious or thinking about it. Like, I don't have to be, not that I wouldn't want to be, but sometimes you just don't feel like you can be there. There's too much grief, or there's too much anger, or there's too much pain, or whatever, to really, okay, I'm going to focus and be present in this prayer. I'm going to focus and be present in listening to this sermon. The Eucharist, you take it, you eat it, and God is present with you, regardless of whether you're thinking about God's presence or not. I don't know if that's theologically appropriate to even say, but I have heard people talk about that, and I have experienced that it's effective even when I'm not able to have the energy to do it. It's almost like, I mean, the way I would think about it theologically is that it is an action of the whole community upon me. It's not dependent only on my attention and action.
I think from a Wesleyan perspective, that makes perfect sense, because when you understand that the primary player in the sacrament is God, then whatever we do is almost secondary to what God is doing in that sacrament. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, and in some ways, the other elements kind of in some ways are dependent upon me somehow. I mean, receiving forgiveness isn't, but repentance is. Preaching, I got to be listening. I got to be open to hearing it. You know, anyway. Other comments from anybody else? I just have a couple more things here and then we'll take our break. Other means of grace that we've already kind of mentioned here, but I want to bring your attention to it from what Williamson talks about, and that's prayer. Definitely prayer is both about praise for God and about communion with God. It calls our attention to God, and it also calls our attention to the need.
Nope. Seem like,
The best.
oh,
No, go ahead.
okay. Yeah, it seemed like you're cutting out there for a second. Was I the only one that, okay. All right, I wasn't the only one.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you might just have to repeat the last few sentences.
Okay, sure. So prayer is something that calls our attention.
I swear it's like the second you started doing it again, it started cutting again. I don't know why.
Okay, so Jared, why don't you read this and then maybe you can talk about it.
Sure. Prayer calls our attention to God and to the needs of our neighbors and of ourselves. And prayer is both a praise of God and a communion with God. Prayer affects changes within us, getting us on God's side, aligned with God's cosmic love. In public and communal prayer and worship, the priesthood of all believers, and praying and working for justice go hand in hand. And so, what are some of your other experiences of prayer? Open that up to discussion. And yes, Zach, that is definitely how gremlins work. I 100% agree.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, you know, because I have the fastest, I pay the highest, quickest amount of internet connection. So can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, no, it's perfectly fine now. Yeah.
Those 2 times were literally the only time this whole class you've broken up.
All right, well, I wonder what God has to say about that. I wonder what God's trying to communicate to us, huh? I mean, I think that there is an interesting point here that prayer is not just about, I'm trying to get God to change God's mind about me, but that prayer is also affects me. So me praying changes me as well as inviting God and the community that I am praying with to be a part of the energy that helps things change. I think some folks have a ritual of prayer that can be very helpful. I don't know if anybody has that or not. Certainly we have a lot of prayer in our liturgy. And then ministry, there's nobody might comment on that. Ministry is, so there's both the ministry of you are the pastor, but also there's the priesthood of all believers. So there's this two-sidedness of the discussion about ministry, because we're all called to be the priesthood of all believers. We're all called to administer in God's world and God in the church, but there are ministers who have a calling, who are ordained, and that ministry is a call to equip and educate and empower the members of the church to be the community of God, the community of Christ in the world for service, for serving others. And that service includes listening, it includes healing, directing, whether that's spiritual direction or directing, here's some things that need to be done in terms of administration, and what needs to be done for the church to function. facilitating, bringing the energy out, bringing out the wisdom that's within, but also facilitating communities, to groups, helping people in the church make godly and wise decisions about how we want to spend our time and our money and our energy. It's about witnessing as well. And you recall Williamson talks about witnessing at the beginning of his book, where he talks about theology and witness, right? That the work of this book is about theology and witness, and theology is about thinking critically about how we understand things. And witness, though, is about interpreting scripture in a way, and scripture and life in a way that brings God's transforming power into their lives and into other people's lives. So witnessing is me sharing the ways in which my life has been transformed by God's love and God's power, and inviting you to also experience that. Ministry is also about representing. So making present, not giving another present, but representing, making present again the ministry of Jesus for others in our community, in the church community and beyond, the community beyond our church. It's through preaching, presiding, educating, administrating. And you notice he talks about each one of these, and caring for God's people in the world. And many of you, I think, are called to the ordained ministry, and see yourselves functioning in these, with this means, in this means of grace as ministers. And I encourage you to reflect upon what that ordination means, whether you think of it as a means of grace that's a sacrament, or a means of grace that's a calling, a means of grace that is feeling it or experiencing grace in a different way. When you are the minister through whom God's presence is with the person who is dying, who is with the mother who's lost a child, who's with someone who is angry at what's happening in the political world, that the grace flows through you. In some ways, it's a different kinds of the different end of the grace. It's not the giving end, like I'm not giving the grace if I'm the pastor, and I'm not receiving it explicitly, it's flowing through me. And it's interesting to reflect upon that. And I'm sure that you've each had some kind of experience of that. If anybody would like to share anything about that, feel free to.
I would say, as I've been working, and even I've started preaching a little bit, I would say I am still getting something out of it. It comes back to me maybe differently than what I'm giving forth, but I can definitely feel or see evidence of God's working in those things, whether it be evidence of my words, how they're reflecting off of people, or in just the immediate, like out at Teeter, for example, if I'm educating people, they're taking it into their heads and putting it into practice in a way that they can take home with them.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I don't know. I think I like my sacrament viewpoint. I guess I was probably most like influenced by Yoder's body politics. So there's something about like this. I think I like appreciate James Cone's understanding of the church as like both working out liberation and living as if liberation already exists. So that kind of like prefigurative politics kind of way of viewing things. So I don't know how that relates to this idea of means of grace. When it comes to sacraments, I mean, I've had people talk about that when I talk about baptism and communion. I've had people say, well, you don't want to ever, even with baptism, you don't want to ever stop a means of grace or like police a means of grace. But if it's a prefigurative politic, well, then it's always communal. It's a way of being and activities and rituals which both like witness or are founded on this idea that something is true that maybe the world doesn't believe is true or act as if is true, and is shaping you, reforming your culture so that you are able to live in that world where this thing is true, and anticipating the future when it is actually fully true for everyone. So grace would be something that I see as like that foundational principle. So this idea of graciousness, that our economics are fundamentally founded on a gratuity that is not something we earn. And so then how do you, so I was thinking out loud. So anyway, but I would just think about it more in terms of those kind of ways of thinking, not like it's a means of grace, and as if like me as an individual somehow have this like great feeling of grace from God that is helping me be saved, but that we as a community are being shaped in a way that our community functions on this foundation of a graciousness that's different than the world functions. But it's communal then, so there's a kind of a stickiness around how the boundaries of a community, right? So
yeah, when you were talking, it reminded me a little bit of the sanctification and justification that we mentioned before, but didn't really dwell upon, because I think it's well, we did talk a little bit about it because Wesley does talk a lot about that as well, and so does Luther. But so the church is almost like the justification, and then as that grace is growing outward, that's the sanctification. So the sanctifying of the world toward the eschaton. It's not exactly what you said, but that's what came to mind when you were talking about, having the grace change us and enable us to work for changes outside of our community as well. Yeah.
But that's why I like the potluck image, is because there's an abundance that everyone can eat, and there's always something left over.
Yeah.
As opposed to the little wafer that you get. Doesn't really speak to me.
Well, I mean, the joke used to be before COVID that, Episcopalians, we've got eight sacraments. The eighth sacrament is the coffee hour, and it always has the best treats after church. Jared will highlight that. Gosh, I can't wait till we have those again. Yeah.
My kids, okay, so we do prayer most evenings, and then we did our first Advent lighting, and the whole theme was hope. And so we said, well, what is the thing that you hope for that you don't experience right now, and that and my son said coffee hour at church. He's 8.
I like him. Yes, Professor Byer, you wanted to make a couple comments? Did he leave?
No, I'm right here.
Oh, okay. There you are.
There. Yes, first I want to thank you for having me in your class. A very interesting discussion. Yeah, I was fascinated by the kind of embodied way that you were talking about the sacraments, and even the physical orientation and all of that, sort of in terms of the sun rising and all of that, which made me think of, from a psychological perspective, I think, of course, about what's the function of sacraments or of prayer, of ministry, and that might be interesting for you to think about as well, sort of what's the psychological function for those in the lives of people, right? Because with baptism, we're at birth, which is very deeply connected to our human experience. With the Holy Meal, we're connected with feeding, with nurture, with undoing the guilt of nurture that we experience. There's a very interesting connection between the Holy Communion, the Holy Eucharist, and the Paradise story in that regard. And just sort of encouraging you to think about when people have these different views, whether they're different cultural views or different personal views, how did that get shaped by their most profound experiences? One book on prayer that I do recommend is from Anne Ulanov, the former professor at Union Theological Seminary. It's called The Psychology of Prayer. Let's see, I can send it to you. It's called Primary Speech, The Psychology of Prayer, which is a really interesting. She was a professor of psychology and psychiatry at Union Theological Seminary for many years. Now it's Pamela Cooper White, and beautifully written about the different meanings of prayer.
Thank you so much, Professor Beyer. Well, I'm going to suggest that we take a break unless there's somebody that just has to get one more statement in. And when we come back, Chance will actually talk. Yes. We will be doing Chance's. I sent that to everyone, so you have that in your email. And I'm sure Chance will. I've allowed you to share. I've shared, so you can share screen as well. So if you want to share that, or a PowerPoint or whatever it is that you have, Chance. So let's go ahead and come back at 5 after 3 and give Chance a chance. Sorry. Give us the opportunity to engage Chance's questions and summary of this material. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Beyer, for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, folks. So how's everything going? Zach?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, this week is this paper and the paper for Dr. Frankie's class. So
yeah.
that's the
And
two
Dr.
papers.
Frankie's class is on John.
Romans.
Oh, Romans.
Yeah, the Romans intensive. So we've got that big exegesis paper. Chance is shaking his head because he knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought those papers were due in a different time.
I I thought they were due on Saturday, and then I looked and no, it's Friday. So yeah, but
Huh.
Cone has actually given me a lot of good basis for my hermeneutic that I've chose to use. So
Well, good.
yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, Chance, how are you feeling?
I'm exhausted, but I'm almost there. Finish line is like just 2 weeks away, and it's seminary's over with, and so it's
Yeah, it was pretty
exciting and exhausting, and I've done this one semester, this last semester, as a full-time minister, and I have a whole new appreciation for the people who are doing this as full-time ministers. Just almost, it's been almost impossible for me. I couldn't imagine the whole process being this way.
Turn everything you learn here into a Sunday school class or a newsletter article. That's pretty much what I've learned how to do. Just take portions of what you're doing here and just
Dick it in.
Yeah, I could have turned half of my papers into newsletter articles.
Well,
Yeah.
good. That's smart.
That is
Can
smart.
be, but then it can also be pretty detrimental when they don't want to hear what you have to say. So
Yeah. Well, sometimes the hope was that that podcast would be assignment would be something to get
mhm.
your feet wet and a way of communicating some of these things to your flock. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I just have to interrupt Chance for just 1 second. Sarah Lynn, can I see that little dog of yours?
I'm dog sitting.
Who's this little guy? He is so cute.
This is Ernie and this is Bert. And they're a bonded pair of old beagles.
Oh, they're so cute.
I had to put all of my books on the other chair so they would sit next to me.
I love it. All
We
right.
just
Well,
got
thank
2 new cats and they're eating all of our books right now. So
Yeah, birds do that too. Not the hardbacks, just the paperbacks.
everything's
All right, well, I'm going to turn everything over to Chance, and I do hope that each of you has a great time finishing up your. Is that you?
I think that's Dee Dee's mic's on, I think.
Oh, okay. Has a great time finishing up your credo, and congratulations, Chance, for you're almost done with seminary.
Woohoo! All right. So you guys read this week about the church, and we talked about it today too. Cone's understanding of it and Williamson's understanding of it. And I just kind of highlighted in my discussion starter the differences between the two. You see Cone is as we kind of expect, the church is community seeking liberation, and they are fighting for liberation constantly. And if they're not fighting for that, then they're not fulfilling their purpose, what they were made to do. Can you all hear me? Yes? Dee Dee, can I ask you to mute real quick? Good? All right. Thank you. All right, so that's Cone's. That's a little understanding about Cone. We've talked at length today about that. And Williamson's, I love the way Dr. Russell put it. Church is about internal care and outreach. Williamson went at length about sacraments, and so some of the questions I want to pose to you is let's start with James Cone. Is Cone's focus on liberation so radical that it minimizes the role that worship, community, and refuge play in the church? Or those things that seem to be missing in your reading of Cone's understanding of the church?
I don't think so, because I think all of that is really tied into liberation. Yes, so that's my short answer to it. Although it might be, I think liberation serves as primary, and everything else kind of falls under that. And so, although he didn't state it, I think it is inclusive.
Okay, does anybody agree, disagree?
Well, I think that the definition of worship is something like ascribing worthiness to something. And so that being the case, anything that you're doing towards the liberation of the oppressed is going to be an act of worship. So worship doesn't have to be the actual service where you're sitting through acts of praise or a sermon or something. It can actually be the action enacted towards that which is perceived to be the will of God, which in this case is the liberation.
Okay. Am I the only one who disagrees with what Reagan said? How about that?
I don't think I'm not going to force myself into an agree or disagree camp as much as I think it partially does, hinge around how broadly we're using the term liberation here. If we are meaning it only in a sort of kind of social economic justice sense, of kind of freeing the material conditions of the oppressed, then I would think that is too narrow. Obviously it's an important part of the church's praxis, and I know Cone is drawing particular attention to that. So it's one thing to do that contextually for what I'm doing in this work, and maybe it's sometimes kind of in this is Cone, an earlier version of Cone where he's kind of more polemical. So I'm trying to give him as like fair of a reading as I can. So maybe that's kind of how, but then he also writes as if this is just the mission of the church. So I'm not exactly sure. It's kind of like saying the mission of the church is love. Sure, that I can interpret that word broadly enough to kind of encompass everything and not make it look selective, but it can at that point really get, only be trivially true that, okay, this is somehow helping liberation in a broad sense. And, then you also have the issue of, are we talking just about collective liberation or individual liberation? And I mean, I know most people, including Cone, would stress the interconnectedness of both, but they do still have some degree of separation, and it can be difficult to tell where one ends and one begins, but there is something there and it applies differently. So, is liberation from one's individual sin still sort of liberation? And, even is liberation a negative thing, the absence of having an oppression, or is it the possibility to do something? But now I'm getting off track, but you get what I mean. I think it largely hinges around how broadly we're defining liberation, and is it just a contextual issue for Cone in terms of what he's trying to make an important part of the theological agenda, or is it kind of suffering from the problem of being too broad to not really actually say anything that important anymore?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. Is it so broad that it's meaningless isn't the right word, but I think he narrows it down. I think he says it in a way that is, the mission of the church is to seek freedom, which he describes earlier in the book. That is what the church is meant to be after. And while I do believe that is a branch of the church, part of me wonders about this: love God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. And while I hear an argument that is loving God by loving people, are the two separate in your mind? That might be a good question to ask. Are the two separate in your own minds of loving God and loving people?
Well, I mean, in John's letters, they're not. I think it's pretty clear that, like, if you try to separate it and if it results at all in the expense of loving your neighbor, then you're not loving God anymore. So if worship is a part of the mission of the church, it must be expressed in loving your neighbor. I mean, if it's not, then you're not doing it. So I don't know. I like think of sometimes I do feel like Cone gets a little bit too like narrow in the way that he talks about things. But when I think about in practice, like what this kind of work has looked like in the world, I think it can encompass like everything in the church. Like I'm doing a book study on Resma's book, My Grandmother's Hands, in my church. And we're just on the last chapter today where he talks about the last section where he talks about what it looks like to build new cultures. And it pretty much sounds like a religious community. I mean, he talks about like, and he references that religious communities do these things. Like he talks about, throughout the book, he talks about connecting to infinite source in order to have the foundation for like healing and being able to be calm and present in situations that are like not oppressive or harmful or triggering for traumatic purposes. So he talks about connecting with infinite source. He talks about creating rituals. He talks about singing together. He talks about all the things that you do in churches. And all of those things that you do in churches are for the sake of creating a healthy culture that is liberatory, that is not oppressive to anyone.
Yeah. And Chance, this is making me think about like, there's a book that I really like that I'm like referencing from my Romans paper that's a lot of us are in that class, where the author talks about how like if we ended all of our current systems of oppression today, like they just magically were over, we would probably, when we go to make something new, duplicate them because that's all we know how to do. If we aren't like stretching our imaginations to what other kinds of worlds are possible. And so like, I think that's part of what is crucial about the work of faith communities is that they can help like the kind of spiritual formation that takes place there can help us not replicate those other kind of like oppressive systems. So I don't know, like, again, like where James, like what kind of faith formation like James Cone is imagining happening within the context of the church. But I do think that is an important element of what church communities do in pursuit of liberation. And I do think in some ways, the way that Cone talks about identity and talks about, I do think the way that he talks about identity can be limiting to that kind of imagination. So, but I also think he kind of acknowledges that in his foreword, that he has been limited in the past and like has become more expansive. So I don't know.
And he does later in his work, I think, become that way. I think Jared referenced that, like in the cross and the lynching tree.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Around question 1, Reagan, I didn't mean to single you out there. You all right? Nope. Talk to me. What's up?
No, man, I'm good. I'm good.
Good. And so I just wanted to wrestle through that a little bit. Was there something missing from Cone for anybody else? How about this is your last call for Cone, and we'll move on to Williamson. Is this your last call that something was missing in his idea of the church to you? All right. I see Dr. Russell typing. Is she typing here? Nope.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that, like I said, I don't think Cone is as, like, I had to reach in my imagination to other people to imagine what it would look like in the church, to include singing and prayer and all of the other aspects. But I do think, like, fundamentally it's liberatory, so, or it needs to be liberatory.
Yeah, I agree. It needs to be liberatory. And so I agree with the idea, but I see that Dr. Russell asked me, what do you think, to me personally? And so I do think that something is missing. This desire to be in relationship with the divine is absent as we strive to be in relation with humanity in an equal unoppressive humanity. I think there is something missing for me in my theology. I am constantly allowed to ignore that need for liberation as the position of privilege that I've been born into, and so what has helped reveal that to me, I believe, is the Holy Spirit and my connection with God and the calling to go be about that. And without that, why else in the world would I want liberation? I mean, that sounds bad saying it, but why else would I be motivated for liberation? In my eyes, that comes before anything else, is this connection with the divine, would be my argument.
So you're called.
Yes. You're called, which is a great transition into.
You muted yourself, Chance.
I don't know how I did that, trying to click on word, but all right. And so Williamson went kind of the opposite direction in my reading of him. It was Cone was specific to me. I mean, Cone was broad to me, and Williamson was so encompassing and so institutional that it was just kind of polar opposites in my mind. As Williamson focused on the sacraments, his focus on those sacraments point to an institution rather than a radical movement. If so, is this institution capable of producing ministry that bears the fruit it was intended for? And so, does that make sense? Does that question make sense? Is there this desire for institutionalism that I saw in Williamson stifle the growth that existed with Cone, the radical movement that existed in Cone's understanding of the church?
I think that's the struggle of any new movement, trying to reform one institution. A movement becomes its own institution after a while, if it goes, a certain direction. So I think that's a constant struggle to try to figure out. And in terms of the means of grace, I think that, excuse me, I think that they can, they are the tools in which movements can be birthed, but we have to be careful about how we use them. And, when they become gatekeepers to the divine, when we start treating them as gatekeepers to the divine, that's when we become institutionalized, I think. So.
Are you suggesting there's something wrong with institutions in general?
No, not something wrong. But we have just the difference between Cone seems to be a community that is on a mission and almost exclusively that, and Williamson has this institution just the difference. It's an institution that's already got these practices that are present. And so no, I don't think anything's bad, but as a new Christian, when I hear the difference in an institution and a movement, it's clear to me that I'd rather be a part of a movement if I'm going to join something. And so maybe this is influenced by the credo. Yeah, DD. Influenced by the credos make this make Christianity relevant, or make it something that I would want to be a part of, whatever that singular question was. Maybe that's what this is rooted from. And
I
so
think it's kind
go
of
ahead.
what we're seeing maybe in the church today, and that the church is continually shrinking or losing members. And so are many other social institutions, but those things that are growing are also the ones that are active in some way, whether that be a social action or a sport or something else that is gathering people together in something that is a more active thing than worship is. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like the institution of church is boring and the institution of football is not. I mean, I would rather go to church and sit in the pews than to go watch a football game personally, but I'm trying to squeeze in that analogy between what you're talking about here, institution versus mission.
Yeah, I hear you.
I don't know
I
if
hear
it was
you.
very good.
And so let me ask this question. This might be a better question. Is Williamson's model of a church, an institutionalized church, capable of bearing fruit in your eyes? If so, how?
Can you repeat the question, Chance?
Is Williamson's model of an institutionalized church with sacraments capable of bearing fruit?
So I would say yes, it is very much so, dependent upon the people who are pulled in to doing or being a part of the means of grace. So within this, we also have the Holy Spirit working through these graces. So if a grace is through the word, through preaching, then you have to have a preacher and you have to have someone listening to that in order for there to be any message working through that. But then I would also expect that not only is there something heard, but that heard should be sparking something within the hearer that is growing them closer to God, and thereby putting them right back into the loop of mission. Because faith without action is what? Not very living.
When I hear institution, I get staunch, right? On one hand, but as I mentioned earlier, I wish my denomination was more institutionalized, so there would be more systems in play, more guidelines to follow. Problem becomes when the institution becomes the religion. So your last question was, can Williamson's what's the word?
His model for
His
church,
model
maybe?
for yeah. Can his model bear fruit? And the answer is yes, but it has to be willing to evolve. You know, the institutions of yesterday aren't necessarily beneficial, you know, for the people today. And so you can keep the framework, I believe, if you want to bear fruit, but there has to be some evolution there. And again, that institution just can't become the religion or the faith practice. Otherwise, you're gonna miss it. What type of fruit?
I feel like I should say something as a student pastor of the church that Clark Williamson was a member of. And I do think like it's interesting. I like what Amber said about how like the institution like um should be nurturing people toward this like missional aspect of the church. And I know for me, like being a member of Central after growing up in such like a low church context, like some of the like ritual of our institution is sometimes like, what are we doing? But then something that Dr. Russell said earlier really struck a chord with me in that I do think that sometimes those sacraments that I'm getting more accustomed to that we like take part in at Central are working on me without my sort of conscious effort in really interesting ways. But then on the other hand, we Central is going like we have is trying to be more intentional about like becoming anti-racist as an institution. And we have like this committee and, you know, they've been sort of examining our structures and to see like how we have sort of complacently become part of this like white supremacist power structure in the United States. And when they went to like give their report to the congregation, one of the things they said was that like all of the people of color who attend our church feel like they give something up to come to Central because of just the ways in which we worship becoming like being very white in a sense. And one of our white members was like, well, this is where I come to get fed. Essentially like, why should we have to change the way we do it? Because this is where I get fed to like go out and do this work in the world. And I, you know, I'm just like, well, like you just heard about how some people give stuff up to come here. Why can't you give up stuff to come here? And we can all like be having like a richer worship experience. And this is where my tiredness is kicking in and I'm trying to remember where I was going with this. But I do think that generally speaking, like institutions, when they become sort of like an effort to preserve themselves, like just to continue to exist as the building or whatever, that's when like the mission of the church really falls away. And that's what happens to all institutions. Like eventually institutions work to try to preserve themselves. So I think the key becomes like how are we continually being called, sort of as Amber says, to continue doing the mission of the church and to not let fear of the risk that takes keep the risk to the institution keep us from doing that. I hope
And
that.
continue to offer those means of grace, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very good comment, Grace. I agree with that. I think it's also probably important that especially if we are kind of coming from like more, I guess, especially maybe like non-denominational or not as affiliated. And this has maybe been my experience since I grew up UMC, but then for most of my teenage and young adult years, I was non-denominational. And I think the irony I've noticed that institutions don't necessarily, being rid of an institution, of course, doesn't get rid of authority, and it certainly doesn't get rid of authoritarianism. And sometimes the opposite can be true. So I guess maybe to give a counter example, you look at kind of the hypocrisy of American Christianity, kind of most personified, it's probably going to be the mega church, right? And those are almost always not institutional. I mean, well, they're trademark usually, but regardless of that irony, but they're very much this sort of independent congregational kind of structure. And it's precisely sometimes within those spaces that somebody who's very charismatic, who pretends to not really wield around. Yeah, exactly. Jim Jones is a good example of that as well. And somebody who can wield that sort of charismatic power and have an influence on people, sometimes a very toxic influence, And I hate to say it, sometimes I call it the cult of the preacher man, but you see it in a lot of, like, especially kind of fundamentalist churches. I know I'll give a specific example, a complete loon like Steve Anderson, who, if you want to look him up, be my guest. That's a rabbit hole in of itself, but the guy's a loon. But of course, Catholics are bad because they have the Pope that's authoritarian, that's the Antichrist. But him practically having complete control over his congregation in both mind and thought, because he gives that good biblical preaching, that's completely fine, right? So I think we do have to caution ourselves, especially if we do come from those traditions, that it often is just as present. We just don't notice it because it's not formalized. And maybe one of the pods, so it's really more of how, no matter where we're at and how we decide to structure ourselves, how we are holding ourselves accountable into our own values. Because an institution can do an institutional kind of reformation of sorts, and can be held accountable on a greater scale, because I know it's not just our parish, our diocese, even it's connected with the entire church around the country, and that's connected with the entire Anglican communion, which is connected with the universal church at large, and we do have to be accountable to that. And that's one of the advantages. Now, of course, does that stop corruption? No. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we probably should be. I'm just saying, to give maybe some pushback from the other side, it doesn't guarantee that by moving away into, say, a movement. Well, movements eventually organize usually around a party or around some sort of platform, which I think is completely reasonable because they have to. But then, it becomes the pot calling the kettle black. So how do we really determine when it's gone off the rails or not? I think that's the hard part.
When it's gone off the rails, then we're already in trouble, right?
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. Right. So
It's interesting the direction the conversation gone is different than what I was thinking when I read your question initially in your discussion starter, Chance, because what I noticed, the difference between Cone and Williamson, was this emphasis from Cone on being a space that is working for liberation and a space that liberation already exists within. Whereas there is kind of like Williamson went through these things, and like serving, for example, the poor or working for liberation was one of them. But that is kind of an external thing to this idea of being a place where liberation exists. Does that make sense? So like that was the difference that I was seeing. And I don't know that it's a difference of institution or not. Like Jared is right. Like we create, everything is a household is an institution. I mean, everything's political, everything is on different levels, like a way of organizing people. It becomes more formalized or less formalized. I personally think for me, if there's a problem with that, it's only in how willing we are to give up the thing that we formalized when it's not working anymore. But the difference that is like that I think is the challenge for the churches that I'm working, like the church I work in now, is the question of, is this a place where you go because it is where you can experience the kingdom of God, and you can't really fully experience it anywhere else? Like, is this the place where there is liberation, or there is whatever, the holy family, a family that actually loves each other and cares each other, a place where your needs are met? Or is it a place where you think you should be a part of, and then you go out and help those other people but like you actually get your needs met, or you do the service and you work for liberation and then external to it? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like,
is it?
We go to a church to worship and pray and seek refuge, but is it also a place that actually embodies what it is you are hoping the rest of the world will be too? And if it's not, then it's probably not worth much. And if it is, then it's worth a lot, right? Because that's a place where then that's starting, where it's happening.
Right. And so that, I mean, that was in the churches about internal care and outreach. I mean, that wasn't the purpose. Am I understanding you right, that this isn't part of our being, it's a branch of our being? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. Like outreach, like that tension between internal care. I think a lot of my experience is outreach is a drain on the congregation. Oh, it's really hard. We have all of these other things we need to do. Well, it is outreach an expression of who you are because it is what you're doing for each other already. So you already are experiencing that. You already are experiencing this experience of having your needs met together. You've built systems and structures that allow you to do that, and then you push out from that place. Or is it a drain because you feel like, oh, I have to go to the church and then serve and in the church, and I'm already tired from my 40-week job or 40-hour-a-week job or whatever.
Or 70-hour-a-week job.
I love that. It gave me a different visual. I've heard it. I mean, I've heard that said before, but your visual of I'm a part of something that I want people to be a part of, that I just extend that out, is different than the drain. I like that. That's preaching stuff, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah Lynn. All right. I thank you for your discussion. Am I supposed to go this whole rest of the time, Dr. Russell? Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, as long as there's a conversation. I mean, if you're done, then we can go. But I mean, usually it goes a little longer than.
Okay, we can
Yes.
go longer.
Yeah.
We can go longer.
I mean, there might be other things you found in the reading, or, I mean, this is a good opportunity because you're in the last class before the credo is due, to maybe talk about how all this is connected, or invite people to reflect upon how all of this is connected.
Yeah. So what does Jesus's church look like? I mean, that's one of my biggest questions, is we can come up with what we want. What do you think Jesus's church would look like? He started it, continues it. What in the world does that actually look like? Nobody knows. Yeah, it's a mystery.
That's
It's exactly what I've been asking myself, says Amber. Go ahead.
So I go to that John 4 piece, right, where he bumps into this woman at the well, and she starts talking about where worship ought to be, and who's qualified. And he responds that, the time will come, you're going to worship on this mountain, blah, blah, blah. I don't know about heart, but, but he says, God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. I think to say in spirit is that mystery we were talking about. But when we talk about the truth, I think we put that up against everything else that's in the Gospels. We talked about love, we've talked about liberation, we've talked about salvation and all that kind of stuff. And so I think what does Jesus's church look like? It looks like those elements and others being present and available for everybody to practice wherever they are. I think Dee Dee said it's a church without walls. And I think that's what that John 4 piece kind of says to me.
Yeah, I think so too. I think a church, Dee Dee, is that what you meant by a church without walls? Yeah. And so this, go ahead.
Yeah, it's pretty much as Reagan described, and I think that was a great text to reference. And then my initial thought with that, or initial response to your question, was just that in which everyone has access, and that walls are designed to either keep things out or hold things up. And so I was saying from the standpoint of around the conversation of tradition, religion, and so forth. So without those walls, the church is able to operate freely, is accessible to everyone. And as Reagan described with that particular text, it's limitless in its boundaries. And so that's what comes to mind, just based around what everyone's been adding to the conversation when I think of a church without walls.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I kind of picture this. We've all probably heard that before, right? A church without walls. Is that familiar to everybody? I remember hearing that, and I like Sarah Lynn's example even stronger in my brain. This extending out of our community, I like a lot. But as I'm forming my credo, I'm doing, of course, methodology, Christology, and then the church. And the church is that place where we can, to me, the church is that place where we can seek after the oneness that God desires when we were created, right? That oneness with God. And in that oneness with God, we hear the call to serve humanity, which offers us a closer wholeness to what we were created to be, a united oneness with humanity and with God. And so as the church, what are some ways that you guys could see the church offering oneness? We have liberation from Cone, and we have the means of grace. Can you think of anything else that would offer oneness to humanity through the church?
Eco-theology.
Eco-theology. How did I know Amber was going to say that?
So what y'all were talking about here with the church without walls was also leading me back to, I think Grace mentioned earlier about our Romans paper, and Romans 8 is what I'm working on. Anyhow, where I'm going with this is I was thinking about the law and how Christ fulfills the law. But then also, if we're looking at creation imagery, specifically the creation imagery motif, which is in the Romans 8, which is how I'm linking this all together. Taking down the walls of the temple is kind of some symbology there with Christ. And then that's where also the eco-theology comes in, because if you think of the temple itself, already inside it is imaged like the Garden of Eden. But if you also think of the ancient structures of palaces and stuff, you had the main structure and then you had the garden outside, which is thought in some circles to maybe be where the imagery of the Garden of Eden came from as well. And so I'm kind of putting all this stuff together and recreatively thinking about those temple walls coming down to allow the embodiment of the law as love through primarily first through the Jewish folks and then out into the rest of creation and the rest of humanity, including the Gentiles, right? And so that's where I'm kind of flowing all that into the eco-theology with the creation theology motif.
I love it. Anybody else have an answer to how the church can bring oneness to humanity? Is that even a goal the church should be after, or should we just be destroying one another in our efforts to deliver each other from oppression? That's a serious question I've been struggling with. In our efforts to liberate from oppression, how much destroying must happen of the oppressor, and where does that oppression when does it become we're the oppressors all over again? We're talking about the institutions just starting over. I get it. We need to defeat oppression, but is there a way to defeat it that allows for oneness to thrive?
Well, since we're talking about our Romans papers too, I would say like Grace and I are both using a transformative justice lens, but I think we're writing different papers. Haven't read hers yet. But like I think to answer that question, Chance, I mean, the idea is like being willing to deconstruct and potentially abolish institutions that are premised on something that is actually not in line with who God is and what God's calling us to, so that impede oneness with God and with one another. And so that doesn't necessarily mean destroying a person. I mean, it's not necessarily harming. Cone and I struggle with Cone because I do affirm nonviolence pretty strongly. So there's that. But like, I think, this question of oneness with God and then pursuing oneness with humanity, I think how we think about justice and justice systems in the world would be another example of that. And so Hannah Bauman is an abolitionist and an Episcopalian, I believe, but she talks a lot about, like, again, how communities, relational communities, can help build structures of accountability and repair for harm that are premised again on this idea of the graciousness of God instead of punitive or retribution penal justice systems. So that would be a part of what the church looks like, is actually doing that work as opposed to just, worship and Bible study and prayer, but thinking through, well, what do we, when the Bible says, translate something as righteousness or justification, well, that is actually talking about the way people relate to one another. It's justice and justice systems. And so how do we do that in a way that reflects this oneness now that we have with Christ, our solidarity with Christ and his death and resurrection, as opposed to doing it in a way that doesn't assume that that's real, that's as opposed to doing it maybe in a secular way then.
But then I would say that comes from the perspective of the person then, and then whose perspective has primaryship, so to speak. So for instance, historically, it's been white perception must be what the right perception is, right? So how do you move that? I think is that what you're asking, Chance, into this? Because Sarah's right in everything that I think she said. It's just changing that perception and allowing that perception to change.
Yeah, and I think allowing it to change is not Cone. I wouldn't say that's Cone's argument, is it? That Cone is like, we have to make it change.
Well, yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah.
But I think today's people that's what the problem is. Today's people don't want to change it, or they do want to change it. And no one's in the middle trying to make it happen. I mean, there's a lot of people, never mind. I'm going around in circles. I know there's people out there working to make this change, but we still have a large chunk of people out there not changing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to agree with Cone as much, again, with the militant aspects of his writing. So I tend to be a little bit more like, we're pre-figurative politics pushing out and with influence rather than a militant, like, a militant way of forcibly forcing somehow something. Sorry, everyone just came home for the dogs.
No problem. Thank you, Sarah Lynn. Anyone else? Have we not heard from anybody yet? Has everybody talked? All right. And Dr. Russell put as Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Hebrews. I must have been late to that one. What are you referring to there?
I'm talking about how God's law is written on our hearts.
Oh, okay. Yes.
I'm expanding that this is a theme that's been going on throughout Judaism and Christianity, and even before Judaism, ancient Hebrew, ancient Israelite connection.
I gotcha.
Yeah. So I'm also curious, just as an aside, I mean, the institution of the church is something that began a long time ago, you know, from the first century in the thirst, and really became aligned with different political organizations with Rome. So I'm just inviting us to keep that in mind as well as we're thinking about what do we mean by the institution, and tearing down the walls of the institution, and how do we know what is valuable? I mean, what kind of criteria do we use? I mean, Williamson talks about that, and some others that we've read have talked about different criteria that we use, so that we don't get caught up just in a moment of, you know, like Jim Jones' community got caught up, or other folks can get caught up in a movement that might not have a groundedness in values that are beyond our own. Just throwing that out.
Yeah, I hear you. I think as we look to the institution and that when we say that, I think the point of our saying it right is that we focus on the goal instead of the institution. I think Grace said something about the institution just constantly trying to take care of itself and make sure it's alive. And so just ensuring that the goal is not staying alive, it's the mission and ministry of Jesus Christ, which hopefully you've written 4 pages already about what that's all about. So, all right, guys, that's all I had to say. I don't know that I can talk anymore. I thank you. Sorry that wasn't the best discussion in the world, but we're close.
Yeah, hang on, Chance, just to reinforce what you said as I began our discussion about the church. I mean, the purpose is not to serve the church, right? You're called to serve the purpose of the church, not the church. I think that fits with what everyone's been talking about as well. I don't know, does that fit, do you think, Chance?
Yeah, I think that fits right on, without a doubt. I think that is hitting the nail on the head.
All right, well, thank you all very much. We will meet next time briefly. So I invite you to do well on your creation of your credos, and feel free to engage each other. I mean, I know I invited you to get some feedback from each other on your Christology portion. So if that was helpful for you, I encourage you to do that with the other section as well, if you'd like. I know that it's a busy time of the semester, so you might not have time to do that, but I think it's really important, this credo, this stating what it is that you believe and how it relates to your understanding of ministry, I think will be an important part of your education formation here. So thank you very much. Wonderful conversation. Great discussion. Any other last points? All right. Well, thanks very much. See you all next week for a little bit.